Ireland. I mentioned that at the top of the show. Throughout the pandemic and across the world, politicians have paraded their top scientists, some may say even hidden behind them to justify their COVID responses, always claiming to be following the science. But something very different happened this week when Irish scientific advisors told the Dublin government they needed to return to a full lockdown. The politicians, they said no. The Taoiseach, the Prime Minister, Martin, rejected the recommendation to revert to level 5. That's the maximum alert level in Ireland, while Deputy Prime Minister Varadkar said that the scientific advice hadn't been thought through, his exact words. So what's going on? I'm joined now by Pat Leahy. He's the political editor of the Irish Times. Pat, did anybody see this coming? It sounds quite dramatic.
Well, it was pretty dramatic last weekend, Andrew, and if we were all taken by surprise by the sudden departure from the public health service, the government's public health experts with their recommendation on Sunday that we should go to more or less back to the lockdown we saw for 3 months in the spring and early summer. But if we were surprised by that, if the country was surprised, the government was surprised by it as well. Only a few days previous to that, the public health experts who meet routinely and make a report to government had told the government that they didn't see any need to raise the level of restrictions at that point. That was on Thursday, and on Sunday they held a special meeting, albeit against the background of cases which have been rising pretty quickly over the last 2 weeks or so. And they made this shock recommendation that we should return to lockdown more or less immediately. Government rejected that, and not alone did they reject it, but they were highly critical, both privately, perhaps you might expect that, but also publicly, of the way that the public health experts arrived at their advice and more or less landed it on the government on Sunday without warning. There's an aspect of this that I think is worth just bringing to your attention for a moment, and that's that the head of the government's body of public health experts, a guy called Dr. Tony Holohan, who was very much the face of this strong medical and scientific advice to lockdown during the first phase in the spring. He's been off on compassionate family leave for the last number of months, but on Sunday he returned, actually a day earlier than he was supposed to return. He arrived, he was due back at his desk on Monday. He arrived on Sunday, called a meeting and issued the lockdown recommendations. And this was viewed in government by many people, and a number of ministers said it to me, as sort of a power play, if you like, a signal that, look, Dr. Tony is back, he's taking control, we have to go back to lockdown. But the government took, as you say, a very different view.
Has the government made clear why it doesn't agree with the scientific advice it's had?
It had two problems, I suppose, with the way, with the actions of the public health experts on Sunday. The first was the manner in which they did it. Very quick meeting to make the recommendations without going through the sort of normal channels that you might expect, both formally and informally with the government. They simply landed the recommendation to go back to lockdown on the government on Sunday night. Not entirely without warning, there had been some back channeling, but nothing to the extent that gave the government what they felt was adequate warning. So government were annoyed at the procedure, the process that they followed. But they also took the view on the substance of the public health experts' advice, that while they didn't dispute the grounds on which they were making the advice, it's very clear to everybody that numbers have been going up alarmingly over the last couple of weeks. Their view was that they had to make a decision which took into other factors. And the Minister for Finance, for instance, was very strong both in public and in private, that to take the advice of the public experts and go straight to a lockdown would cost hundreds of thousands of jobs over the coming weeks, jobs that would not come back. And in his view, and in the view of most of his fellow ministers, they needed to see if a less strict lockdown over the coming weeks would work. So their view was that they had to take into consideration other elements, not just economic, but other social elements as well as just the public health advice in making their decision.
Wouldn't one of the things that influence the politicians be, though, as you say, the number of cases in Ireland is rising, though still only about 490 on a daily basis, deaths are 2. The 7-day moving average of deaths are 2. And 7 days ago, the 7-day moving average of deaths were 2. I mean, maybe a lot of people will think, well, if that's the fatality rate, then the government was maybe right not to lock down the economy on the basis of 2 deaths with no sign yet that that death rate is rising.
Yeah, and this is one of the questions I think that has to be answered at the moment. You're right about the death rate. The figures for today is there's only 157 people in hospital with this illness today. There's only 27 people across the whole of the Republic in intensive care units. Now, of course, the worry from public health doctors is that, you know, the numbers infected and the numbers that need to be admitted to hospital and thereafter into ICU units increases very quickly. You get this exponential rise in cases, and all of a sudden, within a relatively short period of time, the public health system is overwhelmed. But there's no sense of that happening at the moment. So while cases have certainly been increasing very significantly over the last 2.5 weeks or so, the admissions to hospital and the admissions to intensive care units of hospitals and the deaths have not been rising. And in that sense, so far at least, this second wave, in Ireland at least, and I think we see this in other countries as well, is much less serious by those measures than the first wave was. So the question, I suppose, that policymakers and medics will have to answer over the coming weeks is whether this second wave is permanently and qualitatively different to the first wave, or whether the hospital admissions, the ICU admissions, and the deaths will catch up over the coming weeks. And that was one of the things I think that fed into the government's decision early on this week not to move to another lockdown, was that they felt they had the latitude over the coming weeks to wait and see if those indicators catch up with the number of cases.
So, Pat, where does this leave now the scientists and the politicians? I mean, you wrote the relationship between the government and the scientific advisors has been fundamentally reset. I saw the Irish Examiner saying that Mr. Varadkar, the deputy Taoiseach, didn't just throw Dr. Houlihan, the chief medical officer, under the bus. He reversed the bus over him again and again. So what are relations like?
That's a reference to an interview that Mr. Varadkar gave on television on Monday night, in which, as the Examiner said it, he pretty much did drive the bus over over Tony Houlihan. Now, the two men have since had a conversation, and they say that they are looking forward to working together, et cetera, over the coming weeks. But what has changed very clearly between the public health experts on one side and the government on the other is that early on in this pandemic, during the first wave, the then government basically made a virtue of saying, we're not going to make the decisions here. The doctors are going to make the decisions. We will at all times take the public health doctors' advice. And that's what gave Ireland its pretty quick, pretty draconian, fairly extensive, and ultimately quite successful lockdown in terms of how it suppressed the virus before the summer. But at this stage, in this second wave, I think what the government is saying, given the economic damage that has been done and the sort of pressure that the social fabric, both collectively and individually, has been under in many cases, they've taken the view that while deaths and ICU admissions remain under control, they have got to take a whole heap of other factors into consideration when they're making their decisions. And like it or not, that means that the public health advice is only, the scientific advice is only one factor that they consider rather than the only factor that they consider. So in that respect, the relationship has changed profoundly, I think.
I had a final question on this before we move on, but I hope you'll stay with us because I'm sure people will have questions to ask, because the Irish experience is fascinating to follow. I assume that the Prime Minister, the Taoiseach, has got complete coalition. Ireland has always been governed, but is being governed by a coalition. That he's got the coalition around him in support of this, because if it turned out to be wrong and the government actually had to move to tougher lockdown steps, that would probably be a political crisis for the government.
Yeah, I attended the press conference late in government buildings on Monday night when this, after this decision was announced, and the health minister, when asked this question, said, "Look, it's not about who's right and who's wrong here." Well, I think it might actually turn out to be.
Yes, exactly. I was going to say, it sounds to me like it is.
If the government is proved over the coming weeks, if you do get this rapid advance in hospital admissions and ICU admissions and subsequently deaths, and if the government in layman's terms is seen to have been wrong, then I think, it will come under very severe political pressure. At present, and we have an opinion poll which will be published in the Irish Times later this evening, which shows that public backing for the government remains pretty strong. I think if it's seen to have got this wrong by the progress of the virus over the coming weeks, then I think just as the politics will turn on them, I think public opinion will turn on them, and clearly that could be very serious for them.